Hey everybody, welcome back to History Student Reacts. Today we'll be watching History of Russia Part 3. So last time we witnessed the exploits of Peter the Great, one of the most important czars in Russian history, who was a great modernizer, bringing Russia closer to the Western powers. Then we had, the five empresses, that period, some average, bad, and okay rulers. Now we're going into this episode with, the other greatest leader in Russian history, Catherine the Great. Similar to Peter in many ways, so I'm excited to get into this one. If you guys end up enjoying this video, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like and check out the Patreon, which is linked down below. Without any further ado, let's jump into this reaction. Alright, part 3. Getting to some exciting times, by the way. Catherine, then after her, I don't know if we'll touch on it in this episode, but we get the French Revolution, the Napoleonic Wars. We've got a lot of good stuff coming up.
In the early 1700s, Peter the Great's reforms put Russia on the path to becoming a great European power.
Yep.
But it was his grandson's German wife, Catherine, who deposed her husband to become Empress of Russia, who oversaw the completion of that transformation.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, she really continued Peter the Great's mission. That's why I said they were similar in many ways. Of course, different time periods. She was decades after Peter the Great, so, they had different problems to deal with, but sort of the same general goal, to modernize Russia, make it a great power, and bring it closer to the great Western powers.
Like Peter, she too would be remembered as the Great.
Yeah.
Catherine was a student and admirer of the French Enlightenment.
Yes.
And even corresponded with the French philosopher Voltaire.
Yes, so I don't know how much we'll get into it in this episode, but Catherine was what we call an enlightened despot. They were all across Europe at this time. And what that means is if you look at the previous century, the 17th century, there was the development of these absolute monarchs. Monarchs who claimed that they ruled by the grace of God, and so all authority flowed through them, right? They didn't want any parliaments, nobles, the people obstructing their will. They were an absolute monarch. They wanted to have absolute power. Louis XIV is the best example of this, and Peter the Great is kind of an example of that as well, though he was different in some ways. Now, sort of the trend of the mid to late 18th century was the enlightened despot. Now, they're a despot, so it's still a monarch who has absolute control. Don't be mistaken, but they're enlightened. What that means is they took some cues from the Enlightenment. The main example of one of these was Frederick the Great. He was sort of the archetypical enlightened despot. Catherine is another very famous one. There were several throughout the continent at this time. And so basically, they wanted to modernize their countries. Particularly, they wanted to modernize administration. So make bureaucracy more meritocratic, centralize power, sort of remove all these old institutions that are based on family ties, nobility, because that's not necessarily the best way to get things done. Some of them would reform tax systems, reform stuff like capital punishment, make the punishment for crimes less brutal, make the legal system more fair. There was basically a lot of stuff that was contained, but they were drawing from the Enlightenment. So, if you think about sort of enlightened values, that's sort of what they were following. Now, some would argue there's sort of an inherent contradiction in an enlightened despot, in that, they claim to care for the people and to be a servant of the people, and yet they allow no one to wield power but themselves. They still wish to wield absolute power, and I definitely think that is a contradiction. Many Enlightenment philosophers, like Diderot, pointed that out. But other Enlightenment philosophers, like Voltaire, he loved a good enlightened despot. He had quite the relationship with Frederick the Great. He corresponded with Catherine. So, a very interesting period in European history. I could talk all day about this, but that's sort of a brief overview.
She reigned as an enlightened autocrat. Her power was unchecked, but she pursued ideals of reason, tolerance, and progress. Catherine became a great patron of the arts and learning. Schools and colleges were built. The Bolshoi Theatre was founded, as well as the Imperial Academy of Fine Arts.
Yeah, so, I mean, this is exactly what I'm talking about. She's doing all these things to introduce, reason and art and culture, but they're all done under her power, She's wielding absolute power. And she was a big advocate for absolute power, more so than a lot of other enlightened despots, because she was a Russian czar, or czarina, if you want to call her that. She wielded more absolute power than most of her Western contemporaries did. So she was a big advocate for that. But most enlightened despots were an advocate for maintaining state power in their own hands to some extent.
While her own magnificent collection of artwork now forms the basis of the world-famous Hermitage Museum.
Yeah.
Catherine encouraged Europeans to move to Russia to share their expertise.
Diderot would help buy French art for Catherine, the famous French philosophe Diderot. He'd buy art for her in Paris, though, to be honest, it's not like... It was more she was giving him a gig to pay him money, because, he needed a bit of a cash injection. But there's an interesting fact for you.
Expertise, and helped German migrants to settle in the Volga region, where they became known as Volga Germans. Their communities survived nearly 200 years, until, on Stalin's orders, they were deported east at the start of World War II.
Yeah, and by the way, that's true for... If you look throughout Central and Eastern Europe up until World War II, there's a lot of Germans everywhere. I mean, the Balkans, the Baltics, throughout Eastern Europe. I mean, there's Germans spread throughout. Following World War II, the Eastern European powers and the Soviet Union, the main Eastern European power, they were all pretty mad at the Germans, and so they kicked them out, evicted them, and sent them all back to Germany. And that's why today you don't really see too many communities, or at least big communities of ethnic Germans throughout the region anymore.
Catherine's reign also saw enormous territorial expansion.
Oh, yes.
In the
yes,
south,
it did.
Russia defeated the Ottoman Empire, winning new lands and the fortresses of Azov and Kerch.
Yeah, I mean, this just continues Russia's expansion at the expense of the Ottoman Empire. But now, at this point, in the late 1700s, man, it's getting really bad for the Ottomans. The Ottoman Empire is declining incredibly quickly. And as we head into the 19th century, the 1800s, the Ottoman Empire will really become sort of a vassal of the European great powers. It will lose, autonomy and control over its own territory as the European powers just push it around.
But then Catherine faced a major peasant revolt, led by the renegade Cossack Yemelyan Pugachev. The rebels took many fortresses and towns and stormed the city of Kazan before they were finally defeated by the Russian army. Catherine then forcibly incorporated the Zaporozhian Cossacks into the Russian Empire.
Yep.
And annexed the Crimean Khanate, a thorn in Russia's side for 300 years. Russia's new lands in the south were named Novorussia, New Russia. Sparsely populated, they were settled by Russian colonists under the supervision of Prince Potemkin, Catherine's advisor and lover.
Yes, so Catherine, had a lot of different lovers, and it just so happened that her lovers happened to be some talented guys. Potemkin is the best example of this. So they would go on to be advisors or serve different imperial roles. And so Potemkin was a very capable guy. He had that intimate relationship with Catherine, but even aside from that, he was very capable.
The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
Here we go. So, once upon a time, as we've seen throughout this series, Poland-Lithuania was dominant in this region. If we look at the late early 1600s, it looked like Poland-Lithuania might swallow Russia whole. Russia was really struggling, looked like it was going to collapse, and Poland-Lithuania was very powerful. Let's see where we're at now.
Exhausted by war and at the mercy of its neighbors, was carved up in a series of partitions, with
Yep.
Russia taking the lion's share.
And then Poland was gone. Russia, Prussia, and Austria ate up Poland. They took its territory. Now, there would be, during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon revived the Duchy of Warsaw, and then in the Congress of Vienna, Congress Poland was created, but Congress Poland was under the supervision of the Russian Tsar, and, Congress Poland would be absorbed by the Russian Empire a few decades later. So basically, with those exceptions, which aren't really exceptions, following this point, Poland, would not be independent again until really the fall of the Soviet Union. I mean, there was some brief time in the interwar period, but excluding that, Poland would not be independent for more than a few years until the 90s, the 1990s. So Poland, it's going to have a very bad 200 years, basically.
Poland did not re-emerge as an independent nation until 1918.
Yeah, at 1918, the interwar period, it had a couple of years, but then it got eaten up by the Soviet Union again, and then it has to wait until the 1990s. So, yeah.
Russia inherited a large Jewish population from Poland, who Catherine decreed could live only in the so-called Pale of Settlement,
Yep.
and were excluded from most cities.
I mean, that's why there were so many Jews in that area, because the Jews were harshly discriminated against and could only live in that region. And this is also, we're heading into the 1800s. We see the development of, say, modern racism, scientific racism, and we see the development of modern anti-Semitism. And I mean, the Jews have always had a really tough time being discriminated against, but it's going to get really bad in the mid to late 1800s into the 1900s as attacks on Jewish communities, pogroms really increase, particularly within the Russian Empire.
In France, the French Revolution led to the execution of King Louis XVI. Catherine was horrified, and in the last years of her reign, completely turned her back on the liberal idealism of her youth.
I think this is something very important to point out about Catherine. I'm not the biggest Catherine the Great fan. I think because, she was even more absolutist than many other enlightened despots. She was an enlightened despot, emphasis on the despot. Not to mention, when the French Revolution happened, of course she was horrified, as all of these monarchs and noble liberals were. She felt that the Enlightenment and liberalism had gone too far, and so she completely turned her back on the Enlightenment, and she reversed many of the liberal enlightened policies she had passed. For example, she had introduced a measure of freedom of the press. That's right, an independent press was being allowed to develop somewhat under Catherine. Then the French Revolution happened, and she completely revoked that. That was gone. And that was true for a lot of things she did. So I think it's important to keep that in mind when we look at Catherine.
3 years later, Catherine died, ending one of the most glorious reigns in Russian history.
Yeah, I mean, certainly extremely influential and very successful at expanding the Russian Empire and solidifying its power.
She was succeeded by her son, Paul, a man obsessed by military discipline and detail.
Yeah, I think Paul's kind of a shame because I think, he had a chance at being a better ruler, but he really did not have a great relationship with his mother, Catherine. She sort of mistreated him and basically didn't let him in to her inner circle. She didn't allow him to participate in imperial governance, and so, unsurprisingly, he didn't grow into a very good leader.
And opposed to all his mother's works.
Well, yeah. And he was opposed to everything she did because they had a bad relationship.
Russia joined the coalition of European powers, fighting revolutionary France. Marshal Suvorov, one of Russia's greatest military commanders, won a series of victories against the French in northern Italy. But the wider war was a failure.
Well, yeah.
Meanwhile, Paul's reforms had alienated Russia's army and nobility, and he was murdered in a palace coup. He was succeeded by his 23-year-old son, Alexander.
Now, Alexander, He is a very important character. From this point on, a lot of the czars, if not all the czars we see, are really interesting in their own right. Alexander, he's not a great like Catherine or Peter, nor are any of the following czars, but they're all extremely important, and Alexander plays a really important role in Russian history.
Who shared his grandmother Catherine's vision for a more modern Russian state.
Yeah. I mean, like his grandmother, he did want to modernize Russia, though he was even, I'd say, less into those liberal ideas than his grandmother was. He would talk about liberal ideas often, but he would never implement them, and, he was probably more of a despot than she was, honestly.
His advisor, the brilliant Count Mikhail Speransky, reformed administration and finance. Yet the emperor refused to back his plans for a liberal constitution.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, Speransky, he did definitely achieve some reforms, but his idea of a constitution and many of his major reforms didn't work. They didn't go through because Alexander wouldn't support them. Alexander, like all of these European monarchs, was very spooked by the French Revolution. And he was worried that Speransky was trying to introduce this, French Enlightenment liberal policy to his country. And so Alexander refused to back the more radical and wide-ranging reforms that Speransky introduced. Those Speransky definitely did see some success, but really not to the extent he hoped.
Ultimately, it was war with France that would dominate Alexander's reign.
Yes, it would dominate Alexander's reign, and war with France is what would finally really make Russia a great power. I mean, we've seen the process of Russia becoming a great power since the time of Peter the Great. Peter really started the process of modernization. Catherine very successfully continued it, and now Alexander, with the Napoleonic Wars, will really bring Russia onto the world stage as an important great power, maybe the greatest of the great powers. Napoleonic Wars.
France had a new emperor, Napoleon Bonaparte.
Yes, they
He
did.
inflicted a series of defeats on Russia and her allies at Austerlitz, Eylau, and Friedland. But at Tilsit in 1807, the two young emperors met and made an alliance. Russia attacked Sweden, annexing Finland, which became an autonomous Grand Duchy within...
Yeah, Alex had a sort of off and on relationship or friendship with Napoleon. Sometimes they were pretty friendly, sometimes Russia wasn't aggressive towards France, but at other times, Russia would join in on the coalition efforts to defeat Napoleon.
In the Russian Empire. But then, in 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia.
Yep.
At Borodino, French and Russian armies clashed in a gigantic battle, one of the bloodiest of the age. Napoleon emerged victorious, but the Russian army escaped intact. Napoleon occupied Moscow, which was destroyed by fire.
Yeah, I mean, this campaign was a massive disaster for Napoleon, and also just a massive humanitarian disaster. The amount of death and suffering it caused. Alexander's strategy, intelligently, because, Napoleon was the master of Europe. I mean, he's one of the greatest generals of all time. You think you can beat him on a one-on-one battle? I don't think so. Alexander took his army, took his people, and just retreated. He kept moving further east, using a strategy that Russia often uses and China often uses, which is, to trade territory for time. You basically give up your territory and you gain more time, or trade. Yeah. So Alexander would retreat east, let Napoleon capture very important cities, such as Moscow, which would burn to the ground as Alexander continued to retreat. But over time, Napoleon's supply lines would become stretched. They were already stretched from the beginning. It had become more and more difficult to advance. The weather would get worse. And so, even though Napoleon's having this successful advance eastwards, it's not really getting better for him.
And when Alexander refused to negotiate, the French army was forced to make a long retreat through the Russian winter and was annihilated.
Yeah.
Napoleon had been dealt a mortal blow, and Russia, alongside Prussia, Austria, and Britain, then led the fight back, which ended in the capture of Paris
Yes.
and Napoleon's abdication. At the Congress of Vienna, as part of the spoils of war.
And to be clear, the defeat of Napoleon was absolutely a group effort. I mean, it was the entire coalition pooling their resources and defeating Napoleon. But Alexander, because, of course, Napoleon had been defeated in Russia, he felt, like he could sort of claim the credit for defeating Napoleon. He sort of felt like, well, it was Russia that had done that. And he really wanted to assert Russian power on the world stage. So he was kind of a nightmare to negotiate with, as we saw in Historia Civilis's Congress of Vienna videos. But, I mean, this is also what really made Russia a super important global power.
Alexander became King of Poland.
And this is what I was talking about earlier, the creation of Congress Poland. There was the Kingdom of Poland, with Alexander appointed as the king, separate from his position as Tsar of the Russian Empire. This Poland is commonly referred to as Congress Poland. Now, this Congress Poland was supposed to have its own constitution, its own army, its own legislature, and all these liberal protections so that Alexander couldn't rule it as a tyrant. But of course, over time, he would slowly eat away at those privileges, and he would rule Poland as a tyrant until there was a revolt, which he brutally crushed, or there was a revolt upon him dying. There was a revolt, which was brutally crushed, and then Poland was absorbed into the empire.
Then, with Austria and Prussia, he formed the Holy Alliance, with the aim of preventing further revolutions in Europe.
Yes, the Concert of Europe system, these conservative powers with monarchs chosen by God, came together to prevent any further liberal organizing or especially liberal uprisings such as the French Revolution.
Meanwhile, in the Balkans and Caucasus, Russia had been waging intermittent wars against the Ottoman Empire, Persia, and local tribes. The frontier had been pushed south to incorporate Bessarabia, Circassia, Chechnya, and much of modern Georgia, Dagestan, Azerbaijan, and Armenia.
And we can really see Russia expanding its sphere of influence into sort of the modern Russian sphere of influence that we would see with the Russian Empire and then the Soviet Union. They're claiming a lot of these territories that they would hold on to, until basically the collapse of the Soviet Union.
But the peoples of the Caucasus bitterly resisted Russian rule. Russia's attempt to impose its authority on the...
Especially the Chechens, by the way. The Chechens resisted particularly hard, and you can see that conflict has continued up until modern day, with the Russian Chechen wars in the modern era, which were incredibly brutal, and like many of the conquered peoples of the world, or the conquered peoples under Russia, such as the Poles for those 200 years, the Chechens were really having a pretty terrible time under Russian domination.
The region led to the...
And I guess they still are, though. There's no active, full-scale war going on. There's always some conflict going on between Chechnya and Russia.
Caucasian War, a brutal conflict fought amongst the mountains and forests that would drag on for nearly 50 years.
Yeah.
Alexander was succeeded by his brother Nicholas, a conservative and reactionary. But
yeah, a lot of people contrast Nicholas to Alexander as, Alexander was more liberal, and then Nicholas was a reactionary. He went the opposite way. But Alexander wasn't really liberal. Sometimes he spoke big game. When he was given the Kingdom of Poland, he was made its king. He loved to talk about, yes, I love this liberal constitution, and I will serve as a constitutional monarch, and hey, maybe I'll bring some of this to Russia even. Or Speransky, he would say, yes, I support Speransky's liberal reforms, but then when it came time, he wouldn't actually take any action. His action would be conservative. So, I've never really bought the idea that he was this sort of liberal czar. Sure, he talked a big game, but in reality, he was just as conservative and absolutist as any other czar. Though I think Nicholas not only acted conservative, but, he was openly conservative as well.
Parts of Russian society had now developed an appetite for European-style liberalism, including certain army officers who'd seen other ways of doing things during the Napoleonic Wars.
This is the Decembrist revolt. I won't talk too much about this. If you're interested, I have reactions to Epic History TV's newer videos on the Decembrists. So yeah.
They saw Nicholas as an obstacle, and the new emperor's first challenge would be military revolt.
Yep.
Epic History
okay.
TV.
I guess we're going to hit that next time. Okay. This was a good one. Like I said, I think it's getting more and more interesting. Ever since the time of Peter, I find all Russian history fascinating, but Peter the Great onwards, is what I really know the most about, and I find the most fascinating. And like I said, I think, following Catherine, every Russian czar is interesting in their own way. They're all really important and relatively long reigning. So I think we've got a really interesting couple of episodes left. So yeah, I enjoyed this one. I enjoyed it a lot, actually. I know some of you don't enjoy the more commentary-filled episodes. You prefer the ones which are more reaction-based. And I can appreciate that, but from my perspective, I'm not doing these videos just to react. I want to add my own commentary and add my own value to these videos. Because if I'm not doing that, there's no point of making these videos, in my opinion. The whole point is to add more. Add my own expertise, my own opinions, my own knowledge. And I like these videos because I feel like I can really do that. So yeah, if you guys like this one, I'd appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out the Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.